I'm Bill Martin, Assistant Dean of Social and Behavioral Science at FCCJ. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to another edition of Worth Quoting. Recently, FCCJ, along with the Open Campus and our division, sponsored a 6-week seminar on Vietnam, Unfinished Business. It was a highly successful seminar and was concluded recently with a nationally renowned speaker, author, and correspondent. He's our guest today on Worth Quoting. He is New York born, Harvard educated, also studied in Paris. He's a well-traveled correspondent. He's covered several presidents and happened to also be along with President Nixon on his breakthrough trip to China in the early 1970s. But his special interest recently have been Vietnam. He's the author of Vietnam: A History, which is not only a best-selling book in itself, but is the basis of the successful and award-winning PBS series Vietnam: A Televised History. Our guest this morning is Stanley Karnow. Stanley,
good morning.
Welcome. We're glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciate you concluding our 6-week seminar last evening, and we appreciate you coming out and interviewing again with us today. You've done a lot of traveling recently, speaking around the country. I'm sure you have a real good sense of the public perception of the Vietnam War. We've learned in just this 6-week course that there's a lot of interest in this subject. It seems to be a rage on college campuses and public forums and so on. What's your perception of this sudden, or is it a sudden, interest in Vietnam?
Well, it's a gradual process. It's when the war ended, when Saigon fell to the communists in 1975, April 30th, 1975, it was like a curtain went down on a bad play and everybody left the theater and said, okay, we don't want to talk about this. And so it was a taboo subject for a while. And gradually, through some kind of chemistry, a collection of different impulses began to combine, I think, to revive this interest. What are some of them? For the older generation, people who remembered the war, who lived through the war, I'm talking about the civilian population back home, began to ask themselves, what really happened? To a large extent, these people, I think, were asking that question because they were concerned about whether we were going to get involved in another kind of situation of that sort, Central America or someplace else. The veterans who felt, and rightly so, that they had been neglected when they came back or after they came back, began to clamor to some extent for recognition, for rights. And people at the same time began to say, yes, we have to think about these veterans. They were not like the veterans of other wars, of the Second World War, who returned home with flags flying and bands playing because they'd been victorious. Here was a war that we lost, and which was not a popular war. So people began to think about them. The veterans began to organize and clamor for what they considered to be their rights. You began to have manifestations or reflections of this interest in such a thing as the memorial in Washington, which then kind of played off around the country, toured the country in various forms, memorials in other cities. And then younger people who weren't even born when the first Americans landed in Vietnam in 1965 began to say, what is this Vietnam everybody's talking about? And so I think all these things began to combine. And people started to re-examine and ask what happened, why were we there? And I think one of the things that I've noticed is that by and large, people don't want to refight the war. There are some people who are stuck with positions that they took in 1965 or 66 and have not changed, either for or against the war. But in large part, what people want to try to do now is to understand it. And I think that this process we're living at the beginning of a process. We're like, we might be in 1875 or 1880 when people were beginning to come out of the trauma of the Civil War, which in comparable terms is one of the great, probably greater, of course, but one of the great historical experiences of our country, and begin to ask questions in a much more dispassionate way. And I think this is going to go on. Indeed, you know, people are still writing about the Civil War today. I mean, there's a book that just came out that's a bestseller.
Right.
Still examining, you know, did Grant do the right thing here, or did Lee do the right thing there? Did Lincoln do this, and so forth? And so it's a little hard for us, especially those of us who lived through the war and were in it, to realize that we were in this great historical experience. It's like the guy who was at the Battle of Waterloo didn't know at the time that, you know, he was involved in something that was going to be a great turning point in history. All he was trying to do was survive.
Right.
And so we are, I think, in this period, which is a very important one. And is that a good thing or bad thing? You know, there's a Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Right. And these certainly have been interesting times.
Right. One of the things we really picked up on in this seminar over a 6-week period is the intense feelings of the vets of that war. They argue that we're just now getting around to separating the warriors from the war and giving them perhaps the treatment that they deserve. They've really taken their lumps over 20 years.
That's true. I think that it's impossible not to be sympathetic to the concerns and causes of the veterans of the Vietnam War, and for a whole variety of reasons. Part of the reason being that it was a war that a lot of people officially tried to forget, and also because maybe for lack of resources, they aren't getting the kind of benefits and attention that veterans of the Second World War, myself included. I was in the Army in the Second World War, and we came out of that with the GI Bill and relatively lavish treatment after the war. But of course, it was a different kind of war and a different experience. I just want to make one point, though, about veterans as I've seen it, and that is that a lot of the activism and the agitation is probably coming from a relatively small proportion of veterans. I'm not denying the validity of this, because, I mean, there are lots of the 2.5 million Americans who served in Vietnam over the war. I mean, a lot of them have just blended back into the landscape and going about their lives, you know, without feeling particularly as if they were cheated. And perhaps they were. Maybe they should be more active than they are. But we are getting this, I think, from a relatively small group.
Right. One of the, another theme that seemed to be presented a great deal, especially by vets in the audience, and to some degree students of the war during the course, was that they never lost battles in this war, that militarily they were accomplishing what they were, and maybe in their narrow focus, what they were supposed to be doing, that this war was lost in other ways, in other places, and but it sort of lends credence to the belief that this war was winnable if they'd just been permitted to fight the war and perhaps omit some of the politics from it at home. What's your perception of that, that feeling?
Let me just say that I think the war was unwinnable. And that doesn't contradict what they say. I agree with them that we won every battle. There was a friend of mine who was an Army colonel who was later speaking to his communist counterpart after the war, a communist colonel, and said, you know, we won every battle in the war. And the communist said, that's true, but it's irrelevant. It is irrelevant. We won tactically and we lost strategically. Now, why did we lose? That becomes a big subject, but if I could try to compress it or contract it, I think fundamentally we lost because we were up against an enemy that was prepared to take unlimited losses in the war so that you could win a battle. You could kill a lot of enemy troops, and then 3 or 4 months or 5 months later, that area that you had fought in the new fresh troops, fresh enemy troops would be back there. We weren't fighting for territory. We were fighting to kill enemy troops so we would break the morale of the enemy. And if you're up against an enemy that's prepared to take unlimited losses and whose morale cannot be broken, it goes on forever. Now, people back home are prepared to make the sacrifices, to pay the taxes, to have to suffer the casualties of a war, but they can't go on forever. They want to know, are we making any progress? When is it going to end? And if you can't tell them that, they're going to lose confidence in the leadership. And so you can't blame the soldier who was out there, the grunt who was fighting and fighting well and winning those battles. Because, he was seeing a kind of worm's eye view, a grunt's eye view of the war. But there were bigger things involved. And you hear various theories about how we could have done it. One is we should have gone into North Vietnam. Okay, if we had, we would have just doubled the size of the battlefield. We already had enough trouble in the South. And up there, where they had tremendous controls, would have been even more difficult. We also ran the risk, or we thought we did, if we went over the 17th parallel, having the Chinese come in. There was the memory of the Korean War, which ended in a deadlock. And so there were those concerns. Drop an atomic bomb on Hanoi, obviously for political reasons. We would have been the pariah of the world if we'd done that. Destroy the dikes along the Red River in North Vietnam and kill 200,000 or 300,000 people? No way. So we were confined to this area, and I think the average soldier did very well. Nobody can impugn his courage. But we weren't going to win it. We would have been there for a very long time, and we were in fact repeating the same experience that the French had had in their 8-year war when they had the resources, and it went on and on and on until the public at home said, that's enough, let's get out of it. And I think it's also important to stress that the public was hawkishly anti-war rather than dovishly anti-war. Most people weren't saying it's immoral, it's the wrong war, that sort of thing, the kind of thing that came from the anti-war movement. Most people were saying, let's win it, and if we can't win it, let's get out. And as they saw that we weren't winning it, then the pressure grew for getting out, and that's what happened.
Right. One of the unusual aspects of this war was the impact of television on the public at home and viewing it. I can remember it vividly as a high school, college-age student. The vets can remember serving their year's tour and a week later being home and watching it. Walter Cronkite described the war and a camera in the field. Has the impact of television curtailed our ability to fight wars in the future, you think, in terms of just the impact that medium had on the public at home?
Well, let me go back and make a point that's, again, against the conventional wisdom here, and I can demonstrate it statistically, if that's of any value, that television had much less influence on people's attitude toward the war than either the politicians believe or the people in the television business believe. If you tell them that they didn't have much influence, television people are very upset. They like to think that they have a lot of power. For example, one of the big episodes in Vietnam was the Tet Offensive of 1968. And about 6 weeks after it had started, Walter Cronkite went out to Vietnam, one of his rare trips to Vietnam, and expressed doubts about the war for the first time. Walter Cronkite being, right down the middle, never taking any strong positions about anything, in a kind of mild way, began to say, I wonder if this is really worth fighting for. Well, Lyndon Johnson, who used to watch all the networks, he had several television sets with him all the time, exploded and said, you know, Walter's double-crossing me, he's going to change public opinion. Well, the fact was that public opinion had changed 6 months before. Walter, if you look at the statistics, you find that most people, the majority of people, began to turn against the war back in September and October of 1967, 5 months before. So what you had Walter Cronkite doing was reflecting public opinion. Now, he could have been adding to it. Then, of course, the question is, why did people turn against the war? Well, for reasons that I mentioned before. They began to have doubts about it. If you look at the curve of support for the war on a public opinion chart, you'll see that when the first American combat troops went in the spring of '65, there was almost total support for the war. And the line just goes down like that. And it kept going down. We weren't getting anywhere. In the summer of 1967, Lyndon Johnson slapped a 10% tax surcharge because the war was beginning to cost money. Started hitting people's pocketbooks. Bodies were coming home. And most of all, people were saying, where are we going? What's happening? We're not getting anywhere. So to get back to this point about television, if you did a study of television reporting on the war, you find that most of it was very supportive of the war. Press reporting in general was supportive of the war. Most of the actual scenes on television were very remote. They all took place at a distance. I mean, there were, of course, some very gruesome scenes, but the daily fare of television, it got to be like watching Lebanon today. You know what happens? It's something called Mago, my eyes glaze over.
Yeah.
As you see night after night after night of this people getting blown up, houses getting destroyed, until after a while one becomes inured to the thing. And so I think, and I think there have been a lot of studies that have demonstrated that television and the press in general probably had much less impact. I'm not saying none, but much less impact than is generally considered.
Interesting. One of the things we talked about some in the class in our closing session was the impact of the Vietnam War on the current application of American foreign policy. Has the outcome of that war had a retarding effect on our policy and current issues? We hear that, you know, Nicaragua is going to be another Vietnam. What have you? What is your impression of the long-term relationship?
I think there were, let me just cite a couple of little particular instances that I think have had an effect. We were involved in the overthrow of the government headed by President Ngo Dinh Diem in Saigon in 1963. He wasn't performing the way we thought he should, and we were accomplices in this coup. Now that's left a big imprint on policymakers, because after he was overthrown, the situation got worse. And so there have been time and again proposals come up before the President of the United States. Let's get rid of this guy. Let's get rid of Noriega, someone says. Right. Well, how do we know something's coming along that's going to be worse, if you can imagine that? At any rate, so that kind of thing has had an effect. But in general, I think the big, overwhelming legacy of Vietnam has been to make the public extremely cautious about getting involved in other ventures of that kind. You know, everyone applauded and thought it was marvelous when President Kennedy, at his inaugural in January 1961, said, "We will support any friend, oppose any foe in the struggle to support liberty around the world," which was sort of saying, okay, give me a blank check and we're going to go everywhere. People wouldn't subscribe to that anymore. And so when you get into Central America, why has President Reagan had so much trouble in getting money for the Contras, in fulfilling what is basically his fundamental aim, which is to overthrow the left-wing government in Nicaragua? It's because people don't want to get involved. They're afraid that if you start off by aiding the Contras, then you'll have military advisors, and next thing you know, you'll have American forces down there. And that place is right in our front yard or backyard. And people don't want to get involved. Now, it doesn't mean that they've become isolationist. They've become selective. And people are asking questions about policy through Congress, through various fora of their own, that we didn't ask during the Vietnam War. And that's been a major lesson for America. Don't trust the government. And I think that's right. I mean,
It's healthy.
it's a very healthy attitude.
Right.
And it goes back to the basic principles. I mean, what was the Constitution all about? Was to protect people against their government. We tend to forget that. And for a long time, too many people were saying, gee, the president really knows what he's doing. And we began to discover that he doesn't know what he's doing. And the CIA doesn't know what he's doing. And the Pentagon and so forth. So I'm not saying you want to chuck them out and go into anarchy, but they are our employees. I mean, we pay their salaries. They're working for us. So we want to know what they're doing, and they have to be accountable to us. And that's what people have learned, I think, from Vietnam in an overall and some kinds of intuitive way. And so it becomes a constraint on what the government can do. And you may get people complaining about it, and you do. I mean, I live in Washington, and you get people saying, oh, it's terrible. I mean, Congress is tying our hands behind our backs, and the newspapers are doing this, and so on and so forth, and we can't get away with this. That's all very nice. They shouldn't be allowed to get away with it. They got away with it for too long.
That's good. You've had a long and successful career as a journalist and an author, historian, what have you. But you've not always followed Vietnam. Those are not your only interests. I understand you're in a new project. You're working on a new book.
Yeah, I'm doing a book and a television series, and have been working on it for several years now. And it's on the American experience in the Philippines. The Philippines was our only colony. A lot of people today don't know this.
We don't like that word, do we?
Well, we never liked the word, and we
Right.
never called ourselves colonialists. It was tutelage and
Right.
benevolent assimilation was what the President McKinley called it. And I think in many ways we did go there with very noble aims. We stumbled into it. Now, what is interesting about it from a historical point of view is the first time America went beyond its continental limits. Until 1898, until the Spanish-American War, a splendid little war, as the Secretary
Right.
of State John Hay called it, rather fatuously. We had never gone abroad. We fought against the Mexicans, and of course we had internal wars. So this is the beginning of American expansion beyond its own borders. All done with great goodwill, part of our missionary zeal that we're going to go and teach these people, these underprivileged people, how to brush their teeth and say their prayers and uplift them, as President McKinley said. He even said we're going to Christianize them, not realizing, of course, they were all Catholics. But then the question really that I'm examining is, how did it work out? Where are we today? So how did we get there? Why did we get there? Why did we go there? What did we do there? And what's our legacy there? And we are still very, very present in the Philippines. Our two largest bases are in the Philippines. English is the national language of the Philippines. They do have their own national language, Tagalog, but the word for toothpaste in Tagalog is Colgate. There are 2 or 3 million Filipinos in the United States, and there's a lot of sentimental feeling. And so this is the chance to examine, I think, what impact do we have when we're really in charge? Did we really change the nature of that society? Yeah. And the answer, of course, is very little.
It's going to be interesting. People are looking forward to the end of the current presidency there. Is Corazon Aquino going to seek another term?
Well, she says she's not, and I'm inclined to believe that's true. Never could tell, of course. She didn't say positively.
Right.
question, of course, will she survive? If it's a very violent country and murder and assassination are almost routine, I think, you know, with proper protection, she'll survive. The question really is whether survival is enough. I mean, it's a country with so many problems that merely hanging on doesn't deal with the basic problems of poverty and insurgency and regionalism. And with the exception of Vietnam today, which is communist and isolated from the world, the Philippines is the sick man of Asia. When the rest of Asia is booming, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Indonesia, the Philippines is just lagging behind. And it's a very curious thing. I mean, the people are talented, they're great skills, and they perform magnificently when they go abroad. I mean, our hospital system in the United States could not function without Filipino nurses. But somehow or other, it doesn't work at home. And that gets back, too, to a little bit, I mean, not that I'm saying we are responsible as Americans, but we really didn't quite manage to inculcate them with our own work ethic. It was kind of a noble experiment, the American colonial experience. But I don't think it's left a lot. It's left a veneer. Deep down, it hasn't gone very deeply in the society. So then you can ask the question, you know, how deep can it go in any other place?
Right.
I mean, if it's confined to chewing gum and movies and blue jeans and rock music, all of which I have nothing against, mind you, it really doesn't. If we can't change the values in a society we are controlling, how much influence are we going to exert in places where we don't have any control? Which I think gets us back to this issue of we have to begin to think ourselves about the limitations of our power in the world.
Very good. We really appreciate you taking time to come to Jacksonville and present, be our final presenter in the Vietnam series, and to take time to interview with us this morning. You've been gracious in sharing with us, and I know all of our viewers here on Worth Quoting appreciate your time. Thanks, Stanley Karnow, for being our guest today.
Thank you, Bill.